There is a pattern hiding in plain sight across every major American city, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The streets were laid before the cities existed, the blocks were measured before the buildings were built, and the families who financed that infrastructure, the ones who quietly purchased rights to the water, the gas, the transit lines, and the electrical grid, are the same families whose names now appear on hospital wings, university buildings, and public health foundations. The same decade that saw the old ornate architecture torn down is the same decade those names moved from utility boards to philanthropic trusts. That is not a coincidence. That is a transition of power that was never announced. To understand what happened, you have to go back further than most historians are willing to go. Before the Civil War, American cities looked nothing like what urban planners would later call rational development. Streets in older eastern cities were organic. They followed trade routes, river paths, the logic of foot traffic and horse carts. There was no grand design. There was no invisible hand drawing perfect rectangles across the landscape. And then, starting in the 1850s and accelerating sharply through the 1870s and 1880s, something changed. City after city began receiving what were called comprehensive improvement plans. Chicago, St. Louis, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Indianapolis, Denver, San Francisco, Portland. The plans shared remarkable similarities despite coming from different consulting firms in different regions: uniform block sizes, pre-positioned utility corridors, underground pipe systems designed well beyond the current population's needs. And in almost every case, the financing for those improvements came not from municipal bonds or federal appropriation, but from private syndicates, whose members remained largely unnamed in the public record. Here is where the Tartaria conversation becomes more specific than most people realize. The theoretical framework around Tartaria suggests that a prior civilization, far more architecturally and technically advanced than the official historical record acknowledges, once occupied large portions of North America and Eurasia. The evidence typically cited includes the grand exposition buildings of the late 19th century, structures built supposedly in months by unskilled labor that displayed engineering and aesthetic sophistication inconsistent with that timeline. But the more compelling evidence is not the buildings, it is the infrastructure beneath them, the grid itself, the pipe networks, the underground tunnels, the pre-existing foundations that construction crews kept encountering and kept building on top of without explanation. If you read the original surveying reports from cities like St. Louis or Cincinnati in the 1860s, you will find references to underground brick structures that predate any documented construction in those areas. The surveyors noted them, the engineers worked around them, and the reports were filed and forgotten. What the grid-buying families understood, or what evidence suggests they understood, is that they were not building new infrastructure. They were acquiring and activating infrastructure that was already partially in place. The cost models do not work otherwise. The speed of installation does not work otherwise. When the Chicago water tower went up, engineers were supposedly laying pipe through virgin soil at a rate that modern contractors with modern equipment would struggle to match. The same story repeats in city after city. Enormous underground networks appearing fully formed within compressed timeframes, financed by small groups of private investors who then held those utility rights for generations. The families themselves are worth naming because they appear repeatedly and across multiple cities simultaneously, which is itself unusual for the era. The Widener family in Philadelphia, the Whitney family in New York and New England, the Ryan family in Chicago, the Huntington family on the Pacific coast. These were not industrialists in the conventional sense. They were not manufacturing anything. Their core business was acquiring franchise rights, the right to run streetcar lines, the right to supply gas, the right to pipe water, the right to distribute electricity once it arrived. They were, in the language of the time, traction magnates and utility operators, and their wealth was not generated by building. It was generated by owning, by controlling access to systems that everyone required and no one could replicate. Now look at what happened to the architectural landscape in the same cities during the same period. The 1870s through the 1890s represent the peak of what researchers have called the Old World architecture phase in American cities. This is the period documented in photographs showing massive, ornate public buildings, train stations with interiors larger than modern sports arenas, post offices with cathedral ceilings, courthouses that rival anything built in Europe during the Renaissance. These structures appear in photographs from dozens of American cities that have no current equivalents and no surviving buildings. The official explanation is that they were torn down to make way for progress, but the timing is specific. The demolition wave in most major American cities clusters tightly in the 1890s through the 1910s, which is precisely the decade after the utility franchises were consolidated, and precisely the decade before the major philanthropic hospital and university foundations were established. Something was removed, something was replaced. And the people who financed both the removal and the replacement were operating from the same family networks. The hospital question is where this gets most pointed. Before the 1880s, hospitals in America were not prestige institutions. They were places poor people went to die. Wealthy families had physicians attend to them at home. Medical education was informal. The American Medical Association existed but had limited authority. The practice of medicine was decentralized, diverse, and largely unregulated. Homeopathy, herbal medicine, osteopathy, hydrotherapy, and dozens of other traditions competed with what we now call conventional medicine, and conventional medicine was not winning. It did not have the outcomes to justify its dominance. And then, beginning with the Flexner Report of 1910, commissioned and largely funded by the Carnegie and Rockefeller philanthropic apparatus, medical education in America was systematically dismantled and rebuilt from the ground up. Over 150 medical schools were closed within 20 years. The ones that remained were the ones that received foundation money and adopted the curriculum the foundations approved. Hospitals went from charity wards to the center of the medical system, and the families that had built their fortunes on utility franchises were among the largest donors to the new hospital construction wave. The connection runs deeper than philanthropy. The same underground infrastructure networks that the utility families had acquired rights to in the 1870s and 1880s were directly relevant to the new hospital model. Clean water supply, waste removal, gas and later electrical service for lighting and sterilization. The hospitals that opened in the 1900s and 1910s were not simply buildings. They were nodes in the infrastructure network. Their viability depended entirely on the utility connections that those same families controlled. A hospital without reliable water is a disaster. A hospital without gas or electricity is a pre-modern institution. The families who owned the grid also, in a very practical sense, owned the hospitals, not as legal property but as dependent infrastructure. Nothing in the new medical system could function without their cooperation. Go now to the architectural dimension, because this is where the Tartaria hypothesis intersects most visibly with the documented record. The buildings being demolished in American cities in the 1890s and 1900s were not being demolished because they were old. Many of them were only 30 or 40 years into their operational life. Some were newer than that. The official reason given in almost every case was that they were structurally unsound. A remarkable coincidence across dozens of cities simultaneously. The buildings being built to replace them were smaller in scale, simpler in ornamentation, and built using the new Portland cement and steel frame methods that required specific supply chains controlled by, again, the same industrial families. The demolition created demand for new construction. The new construction required materials that were available only through specific suppliers. The suppliers were connected to the same network of financiers who owned the utilities and endowed the hospitals. What was lost in those demolitions is impossible to fully catalogue because the photographic record was not comprehensively preserved. What has been preserved shows buildings that do not fit the narrative of a young pioneer nation building itself up from scratch. the St. Louis Post Office, the original Cincinnati Music Hall District, the Philadelphia Broad Street Station. These were not functional sheds. They were structures that expressed a level of civic ambition and architectural skill that the official history does not account for. The official history says they were built in a compressed period by a construction industry that had no precedent for work at that scale. The alternative reading is that some of them were not built at that time at all, that they were inherited, that they were documented, photographed, repurposed for a generation, and then removed when the new system had been established well enough that the old evidence no longer needed to exist. The same families understood that architectural continuity is a form of memory. Buildings tell stories. A city full of structures that imply a prior civilization implies questions that require answers. A city full of new buildings built in a documented style by documented contractors implies a clean origin story. One of these is easier to govern. One of these is easier to build a medical and educational and utility system inside of. The one that was built is the one we inherited. There is a specific pattern worth examining in the hospital dedications. When you look at the major hospital foundations established between 1890 and 1930, the naming conventions are consistent. The building wing named for a family, the endowed chair named for a family, the nursing school named for a family, but the families doing the naming are not typically the families whose money created the original wealth. They are one or two generations removed. The grandfather bought the gas franchise in 1878. The father expanded it and sold it to a consolidating trust in 1902. The son endowed the hospital wing in 1914. The money moved from extractive infrastructure ownership to philanthropic institutional control in exactly the time it takes for a generation to need a new public identity. The utility baron is a robber, the philanthropist is a benefactor. The transition requires a decade and a building with your name on it. The hospital is also a different kind of grid node than a cathedral. A cathedral is optional. You can decline to attend. Its authority over you is moral and social, but not physical. A hospital, in the new medical paradigm that the Flexner reforms created, is compulsory in a more fundamental sense. It controls access to treatments that are defined as the only legitimate treatments. It controls the credentials of practitioners. It controls the records. Replacing cathedrals with hospitals as the dominant institutional architecture of a city is not just a change in aesthetics. It is a change in what kind of authority organizes the population. One operates through belief. The other operates through need. Need is more reliable. The grid itself, the street grid, the utility grid, the information grid, in its earliest form through telegraph and telephone lines, is the foundation that makes all of this legible. When you own the grid, you do not need to own the buildings. You do not need to own the institutions. You need to own the connections. The water line that feeds the hospital, the electrical service that powers the laboratory, the transit line that brings the workers to the factory that produces the pharmaceutical supply. The grid is not infrastructure in the casual sense of roads and pipes. It is the physical architecture of dependency. Every node in the network depends on every connection. Every connection is a point of control. The families who bought the grid in the 1870s and 1880s understood something that is only now being widely discussed, which is that ownership of the network is more durable and more powerful than ownership of any individual property on the network. The Tartaria framework adds one more layer that the conventional infrastructure history does not address, which is the question of where the grid knowledge came from. The engineering specifications for the underground networks being laid in American cities in the 1870s and 1880s were sophisticated beyond what the documented American engineering tradition could have produced in that period. The calculations for water pressure, the gradient specifications for waste removal, the load tolerances for underground pipe in soil types across different regions, these are not things that get invented on the job. They require accumulated technical knowledge, tested models, prior experience at scale. The official history attributes all of this to European training, to engineers who had worked in London and Paris and brought their expertise to American cities. But the scale of American installation in that period exceeded what European cities had done, and it happened faster. The knowledge base was either more advanced than the documented European precedents, or it came from somewhere that the documented record does not acknowledge. If the grid was partially inherited rather than entirely invented, if the underground structures that surveyors kept encountering were not anomalies but remnants, then the families who bought franchise rights to those networks were not entrepreneurs in any ordinary sense. They were custodians who had acquired legal authority over something that had been built by someone else and abandoned or hidden. The transition from prior civilization to documented history is, in this reading, managed rather than spontaneous. It is managed through demolition of architectural evidence, through consolidation of infrastructure control, through institutional replacement of old authority structures with new ones. The cathedral comes down, the hospital goes up, the family name moves from the utility ledger to the philanthropic foundation, and the grid, inherited or constructed, old or new, runs beneath all of it, invisible and indispensable and owned. What you are left with when you follow this thread is not a simple story of industrial era greed. It is something more structural than that. The families who bought the grid and endowed the hospitals were operating within a logic that required both the physical network and the institutional authority to be controlled by the same constellation of interests. The utility franchise gives you the physical infrastructure. The medical institution gives you the authorized interpretation of physical reality. The educational endowment gives you the reproduction of that interpretation across generations. Put those three together, and you have not just wealth, you have something closer to civilizational architecture. All of it running on a grid that most people never think about, maintained by institutions that carry the names of families who understood a century and a half ago that the most durable form of power is the kind that looks like public service. The same decade, the same families. The cathedrals came down, the hospitals went up, the grid was already there. And the question that Tartaria keeps asking, the question that the official record keeps leaving unanswered, is who built it first.